Hey folks, Chuck Black here. We are doing 52 weeks of Python. We are in week number 27, and the topic for this lesson is Git. That's G-I-T. Before I get into Git, we're going to look at the software development process. So I will compare waterfall versus agile. We'll talk about some of these buzzwords that you may have heard besides agile, like backlog and sprint and branches. We'll be using GitHub. I will in the future be talking about Jira, but not this time. We're talking not about Git this time. So that's in general what I'm going to be talking about. I will be giving you an overview of Git and the different things that we do. We will eventually be cloning a repository. So I will take the repository Python 52 weeks, I will clone it, and then we will point it at a new repository that we create that I called test Python 52. You can call it whatever you like. And then we'll be going through a process that you might go through after we've pointed our code at the new repository. Then we'll open up PyCharm. We'll make some modifications to code. So this is the code. I found out that I had a bug in code that I had put out to the repository, the existing repository. So we'll fix that bug, and then we will commit the changes. Then we'll check the status, and we'll push it back to our repository. So you will get to see all of this in action. Hopefully it will be useful to use, and it's a lot of stuff. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to talk about the software development process. And in the meantime, we're also going to be appreciating this really cool little red doodad that Google Slides gives me. I'm kind of mesmerized by it as it moves around with the little red tail, but I'm distracting myself. Let's talk about software development. So follow along with me as I describe this stuff. You're going to be tempted to look at all the different things on the slide, but please stick with me at least to try to understand what it is that is part of the software development process. I want to give you a heads up about the buzzwords that we're going to be dealing with. Now, the first bullet here is that when we develop software, we are using the agile methodology. Now, things have changed from when I first started. When I first started, if I direct your attention over here to development methodologies, this is a slide that I stole from www.softwaretestinghelp.com. It's a comparison of the agile, which is what we typically use these days, versus the waterfall, which was the traditional way of doing things. Let me educate you a little bit about how we used to do things. Back in the 1980s, I would work on software development projects on mini computers that did networking to mainframe computers, and our development cycle from beginning to the end when we released it was about 2 years long. And we would start out with this discovery process, also known as investigation sometimes, where you understand your business requirements. That we would spend multiple months doing that. We would spend multiple months doing design, multiple months doing development, multiple months doing test, and then we would be done. And of course, the downside of this is that by the time you're done, maybe the requirements have actually changed, so what you're delivering is not what the customer actually wants at this point in time. But that's how things are typically done when you build hardware. You are forced to do stuff like this. You can't do iterative development. But with software, you can use what's typically or generally referred to as an agile type methodology. In agile, you have iterations. These iterations are often called sprints, and these sprints involve discovery, design, development, and test, and then you move to the next sprint and to the next sprint. So there are multiple of these iterations, and this is in general the difference between waterfall and agile, and this is how agile tends to work. So let's look back here at some of the buzzwords that you will need to learn about and know about in the software development process. Now, where do the things that you're going to work on come from? Well, they come from something that we call the backlog. So you put feature requests and bug fix requirements, tasks, etc. into the backlog. And every time you start a sprint, then you take some things off of the backlog and you begin to work on them. As I mentioned, every one of these cycles is referred to as a sprint. How long are the sprints? Well, in my experience, they can be anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 weeks, somewhere in that range. Now, your development may be different, but you generally choose a sprint, choose a topic for your sprint, and you get everybody focused on delivering that thing that is the defining what that sprint is about. When you develop code, you are going to take code and put the different code into branches so that the code can be developed. Code developed, that means at the same time have multiple people working on the same code. You will work on your own, let's say, feature branches, and then you will merge it back into the mainline for development, whatever you call your mainline branch. So you will use branches, and we're going to talk about Git in this lesson more than anything else. Now, where are you going to keep that code? You're going to keep it in some type of repository. There are multiple of these, but the one that I'm using happens to be GitHub, which is handily named since we're using Git to access it and to pull down versions and to save stuff and do branches, etc. But GitHub is going to be where we're storing it. That's our repository. Now, how do you keep track of what you're doing? This is a lot of iterations over and over and over again. How do you keep track of that? Well, you need to have some type of tool. There are many tools. The one that is open source and that is free that I've been using in Quokka and also with 52 Weeks of Python. To the extent that I'm using it, I'm the only developer, so I don't have great need for it, but it is called Jira, and we will look a little bit at that later on. Now, you may have heard this buzzword, CI/CD. What does it stand for? It stands for continuous integration. That's the idea that the code that is being worked on by multiple people isn't only periodically integrated with itself. In the old days, in this waterfall thing over here, what you would do is you would be working in your own little silo as you designed and developed the code, and there would be a big step here that would take maybe a month while you attempted to integrate all the code. You would have specifications for how all the modules would communicate with one another, but integration was a very big thing. Not so in the way that we do it with Agile. With Agile, you are continuously integrating your code. There will be builds of your code done daily or multiple times per day, and that allows you to do delivery of your code whenever you want to. So it's constantly being tested and potentially delivered to somebody who wants to run it. So the code is always in a state of working. It should never be in a state where it's broken. And if it is broken, then it's kind of all hands on deck. Everybody tries to figure out what's wrong with it. And the last thing here that I'll point out that's useful on a larger product scale is this. If you are delivering your software regularly, then your customers or the consumers of what it is that you're building, whoever those might be, they're able to provide feedback and say things like, hey, this Quokka thing is good, but I wish that it did this particular thing, or I'm glad that you did this, but it doesn't really meet my needs. I wish it did something else. Or, hey, I tried to run it in my environment and it's broken. Can you fix whatever's broken? So all of this allows us to have a feedback loop, and this feedback loop gives you information about how to make it better. So as you go through these sprints, you're not only implementing new features, but you're also incorporating fixes, defects, and changes that have been requested by the people who will ultimately be using your product. Now, lastly, let me direct your attention down here. The three kind of main things that we're talking about in this set of lessons that I'm putting out. One, we've already kind of mentioned and gone through, but how are we going to build our software? A technology that we will be using is called Agile, and as you can see from the diagram up here, indeed it is something that is done in an iterative manner, and I've described that. Other people use terms such as iterative, they use Scrum, there are other terms as well. People who are pedants, or people who really care about strict definition or want to show their superiority by mentioning the differences, may point out, well, Agile is not really Scrum, and Scrum has these things, etc., etc., I recommend you just nod your head, give them a thumbs up, and then go back to doing actual work and not worry too much about it. Agile, in a general sense, is what we're talking about right here, and that's the term that we are using. Now, how are we going to store the code that we create? Well, we're going to be using Git as our mechanism on the command line in order to push and pull code from the repository and to make changes, add files, commit the changes that we've made, push the new versions. And we are using GitHub, the free facility for storing our functionality out in the cloud. Now, there are alternatives to this that you can pay money for. Bitbucket is one that I've used before. Perforce and Subversion were source control mechanisms that existed before. We are not actually, of course, using those. We're using GitHub instead. But if you see people throwing those names around, ClearCase, there's a number of others as well that have existed. But we are using GitHub. And lastly, how are we going to keep track of it? I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of this little thing that shows it. I'm just not going to move my mouse anymore. The last item here, how are we going to keep track of it? Well, I'm using Jira, which is also free for the stuff that I'm doing. There are many different options. This is for keeping track of the process. Remember, I mentioned this up here, track and manage your progress for your development processes using Jira. There are really too many for me to list here, but just be aware that if you were just to Google, as I've done just today, alternatives to Jira, you'll come up with the 20 best alternatives or the 8 best alternatives, etc. And you can see those, maybe some that you've used will be worthwhile for you to look at, but I am using Jira and I will talk about Jira. All right, so that's a broad overview of all the different aspects that I will be talking about related to software development, this thing up here. Now, what I'm going to do next is talk a little bit about how to use Git, what it does, what it is, and how to make use of it. So by the way, before we leave this slide, I just want to point out that this is a great cheat sheet for everything that you need to know about when it comes to the software development process. So if you understand this stuff, there's not really any extraneous information on this slide. If you were to be able to completely ingest and understand all of the stuff that's on this slide, then you will have a great understanding of what software development is all about. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. Now, what I promised we were going to talk about is Git. So Git is a source control mechanism that was created by the guy that gave us Linux, and he saw the landscape of all the different mechanisms that were all proprietary, cost money, and he said, you know, there should be an open source version of this. And so he defined Git, and there are multiple implementations of storing information in Git type repositories. As I mentioned, I'm using GitHub, but what I want you to understand is just the overview, and then we'll look at some of these commands in a little bit more detail, and then I will show you me actually utilizing those commands. So what is Git all about? Well, the idea is that you have a repository or two. As you can see, I have two, Quokka and the Python 52 weeks repositories that are going to live somewhere in the cloud. Now, if you work at a big corporation, you may have your own internal network that has the repositories, but you may use cloud-based repositories as well. So this is stored somewhere that's not on your laptop. And that's where the copies with all of the branches, all of the versions, all of the history, everything exists out on these repositories. Now, there's going to be a few commands that you're going to use in Git over and over and over again, and I want to go over those. The entire world and vocabulary of Git is very, very large, and there are people who are dedicated to knowing all of the details of Git. In fact, if you work at a large enough company, you may have a person on your team who's the Git expert. And not everybody that uses Git has to be an expert. So what I'm giving you here is I'm giving you an overview of the things that you will be using mainly when you utilize Git in order to get and maintain your software. Now the first one to know about is this one, Git Clone. What Git Clone is going to do is it's going to take a repository and is going to give you an image of that, in other words, a snapshot of it on your local system. So you will see this when somebody's providing software for other people to use. You can do a Git clone and that will give you all of the software, and then you can just build it. There will be scripts usually that will allow you to build it. The person would have to provide those, but this basically gives you everything. If you wanted to do that, and I'll show you this, if you wanted to clone my repositories onto your own system, you could do that, and it's very easy to do. It gives you a complete snapshot of how everything is at that point in time. Now, as you begin to work on stuff, the things that you're going to be doing quite often is going to be pulling information from the repository onto your system. If you're working on a team with multiple people, then they will periodically be updating the repository. You will then need to do a Git pull to pull down their changes onto your system. So that's what a Git pull is about. And a Git push is when you make changes and you want to store those changes out into the actual repository. Now be aware, you need to be careful before you do your push because you want to make sure that everything runs. If you have automated scripts, you want to make sure that all of your automated test scripts are going to run fine, because you might break the build if that's not true, and you don't want to do that. So just be aware of that. So clone to pull everything down and give you a snapshot. As you're in an ongoing manner, you will be pulling down software to get the latest updates from people, and you will periodically, if you're modifying code, be doing a push to push your changes out there. Now within your local system, this snapshot that you have running on your laptop, you will be doing things such as these four that I've listed here. Git add is going to add a file to your local repository, which you would then at a later point in time push out to the repository in the cloud. When you make a change to code, you're going to want to commit those changes, and so you will be doing a commit and provide a message that says, hey, this is what this change has. You may be wanting to look at different branches that exist in the repository or different ones that you're working on. And so you use checkout to change so that you are working on a different branch. And if you need to create a branch and do other stuff like delete a branch, then there are git branch type of commands as well. So these are the main types of ones that you will use. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail so you have a general idea of what's going on. This is exactly the same stuff, but I've fleshed out what the commands will end up looking like. When you do a git clone, you will be specifying on the command line git clone, and then you'll specify the repository, and I'll show you how to do that. That may be a URL, like for cloning my stuff, it would be https://github.com/chuckablack/Quokka if you're getting Quokka, and you would be able to get Quokka, or Python 52 weeks to get that one. So that's what this repository piece would be like. When you're doing a pull, then you generally just do a pull and pull everything down. When you write stuff out for your branch, you're going to do a git push, and this is telling it where you want to do the push to, and origin is typically, I think I've always done origin for that portion of the command, and then you specify your branch if you're working on the main line, as I do since I'm the only guy. If I'm just working on main, then I push it to main. If I am doing a feature branch, then I will push out my feature branch there. And just so that you know, here to flesh these out a little bit, When I'm adding a file to my repository locally, I'll say git add and then the file name where it is locally. When I do a commit, I'm going to be specifying this message, and I do -am. That's just what I always do. I don't use other potential parameters that I can pass in. When I am interested in a particular branch, then I say git checkout branch. If I want to create a new branch, then I specify my new branch. I added one extra one down here. Git status is going to tell me the status of the particular branch that I am on. So I will say git status, and it will tell me if I have files that need to be added. It'll tell me if I have files that I've modified that need to be committed, or if things need to be pushed. Once again, this is like all of the Git commands that I use in my entire software development life, at least in the past 5 years or so, when I've been involved using Git rather than using other mechanisms, proprietary mechanisms that I've used. So that gives you a little bit of idea of what we're talking about. The next thing we'll do is show you some of this in action. So here we are at GitHub. We're actually at my GitHub site. I've created a user a while ago, which is myself, Chuck A. Black. This is the name of me. So when I log in, then this is what I see if I log into github.com/ChuckABlack. This is showing me my repositories. I have 2 of them, Quokka and Python 52 weeks. If I look down here, I can see, okay, well, a number of people have given a star because they like Quokka, I guess, and less people like Python 52 weeks, or they know how to do a star or not. You can see this too. 31 people have actually forked Quokka into their own environment so that they could potentially make changes and potentially also build their own software that's based on Quokka. 13 people have done that for 52 weeks of Python. I can look here and see how many times I've committed some software changes. You can see, looks like I started here in April 25th, and this shows you even the day. The darker green means I did more commits probably, and the lighter green means less. You can see I even worked on Saturdays and Sundays, so I guess I was a busy beaver. I was doing most of this stuff at the beginning. Lately, I've been doing more stuff with you guys, creating videos, etc., although I have been working on the 52 weeks of Python stuff. Haven't been doing a lot of new stuff with Quokka in a while. So this is a general overview. If I was to go down into one of my repositories, then this is going to give me information about, I can do a number of things from here. I can look at my code. I can look at, there's a way to track issues. There's people can do pull requests. There's a number of other things that I might be able to do here. The wiki, hey, this may be familiar to you. Hopefully if you've been interested in Quokka, let's say, or I don't even have one, I don't think, for Python 52 weeks. But here for Quokka, I have spent a lot of time creating a pretty decent looking wiki that goes into the implementation. I have a lot of pictures that help you to understand how everything works, etc. in Quokka. But I digress. Let's go back to where we were, which was at Quokka itself. So back at Quokka, I can look at my code here. You can see that I can actually look at all the code just right here on the repository, and can click on the Quokka directory here, the folder, and I can see that I have controller data models. Here's my simulator stuff for the SD-WAN. My views, my workers, all the code is right here, and you can actually look at that if you so choose. By the way, this will allow you to look at different branches that may exist. You can see for a while I did a remote worker branch, so if I want to look at code for the remote worker, I can do that. Doing sniffing for packet capture, I did that. Traceroute, I had something. When I did the UI view refactoring, I showed that. I can click here to see all of my branches, and this gives me a little bit better view, and I can look at all the different branches. I can see some of them have gotten stale because I think I probably merged them or did something different with them on a different in a different environment. So this is kind of my overview of Quokka. Now we were going to talk about what can you do if you want to clone it. This is the thing that we're talking about right now. I wanted to show you. So if I was to go to one of my repositories, in fact, let me go back and I'll do my Python 52 weeks because that's where we are. Here I am in Python 52 weeks. Don't know, do I have any branches here? I started out on master and then we all switched to main, so I'm on main here. So, and it's listing me as main. If I want to make a clone of this, that is, if I want to pull down all the code onto my system, what I can do is this. I can click on here and I can specify, okay, I want to do HTTPS. Here's my little clipboard icon. It's now copied this particular path, which is the entire path of python52weeks.git. It's copied it to the clipboard. And so what I can do now is I can go to my system now. You can see I've got Quokka running here. I'm not really doing much else. I do have a free terminal here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back here and I'm going to make a directory called test. And I already have test, so let me make a directory called test clone, and let me change directory to test clone. Now I'm in test clone. Now in order to pull down all of that code, all I need to do is say git clone, and then I'm going to use my center scroll button to click to pull back to paste what I had. And now when I do this, it has just cloned Python 52 weeks right into this location. If I do this, if I list and see what's there, now I can go down to Python 52 weeks, and you can see, if I was to look at this, you can see I have M01 basics, intermediate, files, development process, etc. I have all of the code right here. And this is how you clone somebody's repository. What I can do later on is I can make changes so that I can store this someplace different. If I have my own repository, I can change some of the Git things. You can look up online how to change the repository, the remote repository to which it will store it. The other thing I could do would be to just copy this code. So if I just wanted to, if I'm only interested in the basics, let's say, I can just copy that whole directory somewhere else, and then I can create a repository from there. So this is the basic cloning idea that you get with Git. All right, so I've decided to complete the thought, which was, now that I've cloned Chuck's stuff, what if I wanted to begin saving it to my own repository? So that's what I'm going to do next. And the way that I will do that is by coming up here into my GitHub Chuck A. Black. I'm going to specify I want to create a new repository. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this test Python. I'll just call it test Python 52 for now because I want to make that easier. It's going to be public. I'm going to say create repository. So here's my repository, test Python 52. If I was to go back to Chuck A. Black, which I can do by clicking right here, it should be showing up now in my main. Sure enough, there it is. Now, what I have this repository, and I don't really have anything in here of interest. What I want to do, though, is I want to be able to point my existing code at this repository. So I'm going to copy by clicking on the clipboard here, and now I'm going to use the command to change the URL, the remote URL, for this stuff that I just cloned from the Chuck A. Black stuff. How did I figure out how to do this? I just Googled it, and I ended up at a GitHub page, and they talk about how do you change a remote's URL. So I'm going to go ahead and attempt to do that right now. Okay, so at this point in time, I have successfully, I believe, set the remote URL here to my GitHub Chuck Black test python52.git. Now I'm going to use a command that we use typically, git status. It says that my branch is up to date with origin main, but what I want to do is I actually want to push this out to my own repository. So I'm going to attempt to do that right now. Okay, so I've done a push. That is something that I'll talk about in a little bit. That's something we do normally. But let's check and see if that change has taken place here. And sure enough, here I am in test Python 52. I have all of this code that actually was originally from my own Chuck repository, and now it's in, now of course this is still under Chuck A. Black, but for you it would be in your own repository. Here's all the code. And you would now own all this code in your own repository, and you could make changes however you wanted. So we'll look at how to do that in just a second. Okay, so what we want to do now is we want to start PyCharm and create a project with our new data. This is our test Python 52 repository, and this is where it's located locally on my system. So I want to start PyCharm and create a new project and point it at my code. Now I did this before and deleted the recording because I ran into some issues with Python not recognizing my Python interpreter, which is my Python 3.8 binary. And so I've corrected that, and let's create our PyCharm project now. It takes it a while to load. And right now I have closed my other stuff, so this is all that shows up is nothing. I can open my Quokka that I had before, but I removed everything else. So I'm going to say new project. This is what I want to do. If you open it and it's already in Quokka, then you can just type in new, you can select new project from PyCharm. And what it's going to do is it's going to want to find a location to put this Python project, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to point it at the directory where my code is located. And so if we recall, it's in test clone. I'm going to do my Python 52 weeks. That is where the code actually is. This was an attempt to do something different, so ignore that one. This is my code. In fact, you can see that right here, Python 52 weeks, Python 52 weeks. So I'm going to say okay. Now it has my Python interpreter. You can do a virtual environment if you're comfortable with that. I tend to use a previously configured interpreter. I pointed at Python 3.8. I had to do that manually. And once I've done that, now I can create the project. What it's going to do is it's going to say, are you okay with me creating a project using the existing sources? And I say yes. And now it's going to go through the process of loading in the project, and it will take some time for it to index everything and make it so that it looks like we would expect it to look. I have this README, that's what it opens for some reason. But here's my Python 52 weeks. Now, how do I know that this isn't the other one that's in the official location? Well, it's in test clone. Remember, that's where I cloned it into. So this is now my code, and it's pointing at my directory. This is my test clone Python 52, test Python 52 repository. So what I'm going to do, I came in here and I actually discovered something. L01 device I should be able to run this. It's the simplest thing that we've got, so I'm going to go ahead and say run this. And here we go, run L01 device. It's going to pop things up and everything runs except at the very end. And it says, oops, what's wrong here at this line 27, which is this line down here. It says that unknown format code S for type integer. And I think, well, what's wrong with that? If I look back in the code, I was playing around with stuff when I probably did this lesson, and I left this incorrect key in there because I'm trying to print things as strings, and that is not working. So what I can do is I can turn this into a string by putting parentheses around it, and that is what I will do. So I'm fixing this bug. Let's see if it runs now. Sure enough, it ran successfully, so that's good. So let's go back to my command line and let's see what we have now. Let me do a git status. This tells me what has changed. So there's a few things that have changed. Some of this stuff has to do with our PyCharm. So the .idea, that's where PyCharm keeps stuff. So it got rid of a couple of things. Some of this is what I did before. Yours might be different. Here's the important one. This is what I changed. If I'm interested in figuring out what it was that I changed, this isn't something that I mentioned before, but you can do this if you're familiar with doing diffs. Then I can say git diff and type in the name of the file. Now the name of the file would be m01_basics/L_01. I wonder why I did that differently. So I'm going to do a diff, and if you're familiar with diff, then you kind of know a little bit about this, what has been removed and what has been added. This is basically what changed, and you can see all I did was put quotes around that. I think that's good. Now for the next thing that you will be doing, which is a commit. So I've got everything like I like it. I'm going to say git commit, and now I give a message, and I can put anything I want in here. I'm going to say fixed key of 1. Notice I have to use double quotes here, and I'm using single quotes there. Let's see, for device. That is a device, right? That's my device object, yeah. Close double quotes. Now I've committed it. Now I say git status. It's going to show me that, all right, well, I have this workspace. I don't really care about that. This .idea stuff, I'm not going to worry about it. It's telling me my branch is ahead of origin main by 1 commit. Do a git push. And since I believe that this works in a real live environment, you will have automated tests and run. But in our little environment, what I'm going to do is the command that we always do, which is git push origin, and the name of my branch is main. Notice here it says that I'm on branch main. If I had created another branch and done something, then I would be saving things there. So let's see if this works. So it looks like it did. This is what you get when it successfully does that. Let me go down here. I can actually check in the code. Oh, here's my code. Let me refresh this page. Did you notice what? You probably didn't, but this changed from just a 1 to the one with quotes. Now I've had a commit, and I'm off and going. So I have now done git. All right, so let's review what I did here with respect to Git. So this image shows you exactly what we did, what we worked on. First thing that I did was I did a Git clone. Now my Git clone here, you can see I cloned my existing Python 52 weeks repository. Once I had done that, I created my own repository using the GitHub user interface. So I came in here and I created this thing called test Python 52, and it originally had nothing in it whatsoever. It may have had a README, I can't remember, but it certainly didn't have this code. Then what I did was I went to Git in my directory where I had cloned things, and I set the URL to point at my new repository. So the idea is I did the clone, but my Git stuff, my local Git stuff on my system was still pointing at the original Chuck Python 52 weeks repository, and I wanted it to point to test Python 52. So I did that change. Once I had done that, I created a PyCharm project with the code that I had. So I was in my directory with my new test code, and I went into PyCharm, created a project. I modified the code. If you recall, in the code I had this error where this actually had no quotes around it, and so it was just an integer, which is legal from a standpoint of a dictionary. It was unfortunately illegal from the perspective of trying to print it out as a string, as I was trying to do here. So I needed to change that. So I went ahead and changed that, and once I had made the change, I was able to do a git commit and provide a message. And in fact, if you look here, after I had checked it in, this would appear that my actual text that went along with the message for my commit, the message that went with my commit, said fixed key 1 for device. I did a git status. I did that along the way just to see how things were doing. And then finally, I did a git push. So this incorporates a lot of what we talked about here in our general description. We talked about there being a clone. We didn't have to add anything, but we did a commit, and we did a status, and eventually we did a push. So that's kind of what we did and what we worked on, and the end result was that I have a repository with my own code that I can then work in. Now, I haven't gone over everything that you can do with Git. You can certainly do things like branching, merging your branch back into your development or main or whatever it might be. There's many other aspects to Git that you could learn that are a little bit more intermediate or advanced, but I'm hoping that this gave you a general high-level overview of the things that you can do with Git and what it's good for. And furthermore, I'm hoping that in our discussion of things in general, you have a better idea of the entire software development process. So hopefully this is getting you down the road to becoming a software developer. Thanks for listening.